This week on Story, we're joined by Max Borenstein, the creator of acclaimed series Winning Time and the terror Infamy, and writer on the larger-than-life Godzilla franchise. Borenstein discusses his own experiences as a screenwriter, falling in love with his projects, writing for production, and finding a story's emotional core.
I'd seen Godzilla movies, and I had a preconception of what they were, which was like they were like cheesy. When we were approaching Godzilla, it was not long after Katrina, and it felt like it feels nowadays, where there are these very large-scale disasters and other events that feel so out of our control and horrific and monstrous. And it felt like Godzilla was a really great metaphor for that kind of thing.
At what point did you get on the radar of the monster universe? How did that happen?
The paths we end up taking are so interesting. In my last year of college, I wrote and directed a film that was, and I did it because the same guy who had taught me how to, that there was such a thing as screenwriting and mentored me, said, well, you really should make a movie while you're in college, because there's actors who will work for free and you'll never get that again. And I was like, so like a short? And he was like, no, why don't you make something more ambitious? So I took that as a challenge, and I put aside the script I had been writing this summer before my senior year, which was some big blockbustery type thing, because I knew I couldn't do that. And so then I wrote something that I thought I could do that was much more like, like Dogma. It was like just easy and cheap and with people who I knew I could cast, and then made that, and it was a feature. And it it was a great experience. And then I came out of college and was writing, I was like, I'm going to be a writer-director, and I wrote some movie that I thought I was going to direct, and it actually got optioned, but not for me to direct. And that led me into a career as a writer for a few years, doing rewrites and things. And because it was more dramatic, and they weren't making dramas very commonly at the time, even already then. But if you did a dramatic thing, you could write. I got hired to rewrite thrillers and horror movies and things that were not comedic, and that sort of pulled me in that direction. And then during the last strike, I realized okay, I've been doing these sort of rewrites on movies that hadn't gotten made, but they were kind of horror and thriller and whatever. And I wanted to write something more something that I cared about more, and the strike gave me a great opportunity to just sort of do that. And I wrote something on spec, and it's a movie that then 12 years later I ended up making with Michael Keaton a couple years ago, or a few years ago. But it took that long. But it was this very serious drama about the guy who handled the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. That script got some good response, and in the system, it led to me getting hired to write, weirdly, a movie about Jimi Hendrix. And then that movie, which also didn't get made, but was well received as a script, the founder of Legendary, Thomas Tull, has two passions: rock and roll, actually three. He loves sports, but it's rock and roll and comic books and monsters. He loves Godzilla. And so he wanted to make this Jimi Hendrix movie. When that didn't happen, it was what about Godzilla? I'd never seen the first movie, and I fell in love with that, and that kind of inspired me. And so I came at it through a dramatic lens, not from the lens of being a Godzilla fanboy. But you have these circuitous roots. And then it took me a long time to get back to doing things that were the kind of thing that when I was a kid, I would have loved that.
Yours was one that I kind of fell back in love with Godzilla again. And and Mothra and all of the characters that sort of came out of that reboot. But I think that part of the reason that I did was because I also really liked the characters that were in the movie that were not Godzilla, and sort of got invested in the whole drama around what happened, right? How did you look at that story, seeing it at an older place, and then also looking at, hey, what's this movie really about?
I'd seen Godzilla movies, and I had a preconception of what they were, which was from the sort of 60s, the movies you're talking about, where they got campier, and I thought they were fun, but I thought they were cheesy. But then when I watched the original the original is like a really harrowing, it was made like 9 years after the bombing of Hiroshima, and it's clearly like a, really well, like a connected metaphor for that. There are horrific scenes in it, but it feels you feel the visceral connection. And I thought, especially, so when we were approaching Godzilla, it was like a little longer after, but not that much longer after 9/11, and not long after Katrina, and it felt like it feels nowadays, where there are these very large-scale disasters and other events that feel so out of our control and horrific and monstrous. And it felt like Godzilla was a really great metaphor for that kind of thing. And looking back, as I did, and watching all the other Godzilla films, I realized that he had always kind of represented a different thing for a different era. It was a kind of nuclear fear, and then it was like there were environmental themes, and there was like alien scare, and all the different kinds of metaphors. And it felt like suddenly it was resonant to me. This felt like, okay, maybe we can try to make it feel like, visceral now. And Gareth Edwards, who had, came on right before I came on, like we really sort of connected on that idea, and that became this core kind of principle for that movie.
Godzilla had a lot of humanity to me. Obviously, it doesn't make any sense. And he certainly stepped on a number of people, but he did feel like he was somebody who, on some level, was an almost omnipotent presence in that film. And again, maybe it's because of the characters in the movie that sort of put that upon him. But how were you looking at that on the page?
I mean, Godzilla is a really interesting one because, and we talked about it a lot, and that's all, like, Kong, which, like, has become a part of that same franchise and I worked on as well, is a much easier character to deal with because Kong is an ape and we're apes, and you can anthropomorphize an ape. Godzilla is, and always has been, so not, like, inhuman and so big. That's a real problem with Godzilla as a writer, is that Godzilla is so big that the scale, and we decided to make it as a disaster movie, which means that, like, in the scale of Godzilla, we are ants, and you don't think much about the ants. And Godzilla is this sort of inhuman kind of force. So the idea was, for us, like, trying to really allow the human perspective on Godzilla to be something that keeps Godzilla at a scale that is just, like, inconceivable. But then in the Gareth film, like, Godzilla, I don't think there may be 1 or 2 shots, and this was kind of the plan, where you're more at his level, but everything else is really through the lens of some human caught in it. Like, what it would be like is if, experiencing the scale of this thing from our scale. But then there are moments gradually where and that was the hope, was that eventually you kind of gain empathy for this thing that feels like it is just so beyond.
You're actually thinking about all these things as you're writing this script.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like, and working with Gareth too, he had this wonderful storyboard artist who, and he and the three of us would talk, but Gareth and I would talk sort of story, and then they would go off and they would conceive these sequences and then feed back, and it was a really cool collaboration, and a lot of it was about scale and, like, when we're gonna feel more of that, like, personality to the character of Godzilla and how unknowable it should feel. And there was a debate about whether anyone would ever, like, say the name of the creature. There was all that. It was, at some point you have these heady intellectual debates, and then you go, like, no, we have to say the name.
What do you look back at now and think you got out of that project and that development and having an opportunity to restart something and really, really dig in and think about it, and especially something with such a big fan base.
One of the big things is that, for me, that was the first movie that got made. And that I didn't direct, which let like a budget of nothing. So you learn everything from that. You know, you learn a lot about the translation of your imagination into like actuality, and you keep learning that. But that is just like, for every writer, it's a huge thing to finally have something actualized and to realize like the difference between imagining it and like what it takes to realize it. So yeah, I mean, I think that for me was like mind-blowing, and you keep learning it and relearning it, because every time you get on set, it's a really humbling experience, having written things where you're just like, ooh, what about that? And then you get there and you're like, oh, there's actual human beings who have to do that and take it really seriously. And I remember sitting in our production meeting for Godzilla before, I had written the first draft, and then I was fired, and then I got rehired shortly before. It was great, actually, but it was like one of those painful first jobs where, and then I got back on it, and when I'm then sitting in like the production office, and we were like talking to the actual VFX people and all the different department heads, and there was a sequence where like there was just something I wrote, like Godzilla like stepped on someone. It wasn't like the main thing. It was just it was like a by the way as he stepped on a car or whatever, and that was a big problem. And it was okay if he'd like stepped on it in the distance, but if he had to interact with a person and step on a person, that was like hundreds of thousands of dollars more and a pain in the ass. And they were like, is it okay if we do it? And I was like, oh yeah, I don't care, like, no, but that's the interesting thing, is you realize there's a great responsibility when you're writing it, and they get that script and it's like, okay, how do we realize this? And they look at it, they can freak out, and you can think like, what's so hard? No, yeah, just cut that. And it, like, as a writer, there's a power and a danger to the fact that you have this sort of blue sky godlike ability to just do anything.
So what was that then weigh in when you move on to Kong? Because now you're that guy, right?
Yes,
to some extent,
So Kong was, again, I think Thomas Tull was like, he was a great executive there, because he founded the company and he just had this passion for these projects. So he desperately wanted to make a Godzilla versus Kong movie, which sounded at the time absolutely absurd to everyone who heard it, which is, a huge testament to him. But anyway, part of that was make a Kong movie. So he wanted to do a King Kong movie, and he, during the making of Godzilla, was like, would you be interested in figuring it out? And so that was the sort of genesis of that. And there, for me, it was like, Apocalypse Now has always been one of my favorite movies. Initially, we were going to set it in the past. The first draft I did was kind of like a Heart of Darkness thing, but it was like a journey upriver, and it took a lot of turns and a lot of rewrites and a lot of drafts with that movie. And that was one where I was the first writer in, and then again, I came back later. But that aspect of it stayed. It went from like the World War I era to the Vietnam and whatever, but it was all sort of, it's interesting to see how when things develop, certain things like end up remaining as the spine, and some things like fall away. Some things that felt key fall away,
First of all, cool that anybody is making any kind of real ghost story.
Yeah.
Because they don't happen anymore. So how did that come about, and how did you start to develop that idea?
That was like just such a serendipitous and interesting thing where I had a relationship with the AMC executives, and just was having a sit down with them, and the Terror hadn't come out yet, the first season, and they said they had this really wonderful first season, but it was this closed thing, and they wanted to potentially do another, and what that was in their mind, like the core common denominator would be some form of horror that was historic, like a historical moment that could have some kind of horror treatment over the course of like a limited series. And they were like, any ideas? Come back to us. It was really just a general meeting, but I was like, I wonder, just as a fun thing, I was like, I wonder if I can come up with anything. And I was just looking at my bookshelves and thinking about it. And this rarely, if ever, has happened, but like at like 3 a.m, I woke up suddenly with this idea and wrote myself an email, and then it was still good in the morning, so I sent the email to them, and they were like, that's great. And truly, it was that was it. Because I guess I was looking through books, and I thought about the Japanese internment camps, and then was like, ooh, a Japanese-style horror, like ghost story, because there's such good Japanese horror movies, would be really interesting, and no one's ever done a show about the internment camps.
So was that just your imagination, or did you base it on some kind of lore out of, Japanese culture?
Obviously, like, I had seen a lot of Japanese horror movies, but also we did research into, adapting kind of actual cultural notions of ghosts and from Japanese culture, and it dovetailed really well as like a way of embodying the horror of that moment in a genre way.
So let's talk about Winning Time and how that sort of came about. You know, in this one space for a while. Now you get to sit down and write something that's funny and current and sort of current, but still has a pretty crazy fan base, right?
Yeah.
You're doing.
There's definitely, yes. This guy Jim Hecht, who's a wonderful guy and great writer, and a huge Lakers fan, had optioned this book, Showtime, by Jeff Pearlman, about that era, and he was looking. He had brought it to McKay's company, and they were bringing it to HBO, and HBO wanted someone who they had a relationship to write the pilot, create the show, and Jim wanted to make sure that it was someone who actually had a connection to the material, and mutual friends told him, vouched for me, that I was like actually a Lakers fan, and I was born and raised in LA, and that it would matter to me. And we sat down for lunch and started talking, and he comes at it from the standpoint of he loves it so much, and he had been trying to do it for a decade. Like, he'd been really desperate to make this story because he saw it, and I didn't see it yet, and he saw it because he loves the story, and I was trying to find how I could connect to it, and we were talking, and I was challenging him, and in the conversation came upon, like, well, if we could do it as like a origin story for this for where we are today, and I think like the way that they sort of reinvented a kind of American culture in that moment.
Let's go! And what a great sign that is for the Lakers.
Cheeks out ahead, splits the defender, but Kareem is running in on defense, and Kareem with the block, taking it the other way.
Kareem is in the post, triple team. Oh my! You're going to need a lot more sixes to stop the big man tonight.
Slam dunk! And just like that, the Lakers are back in it, folks, and Kareem's ankle may be hurting him, but oh Lord, he is showing no signs of it tonight. Under a minute now, Sixers watching this one slip sliding away.
Lakers win, and now they'll head back to Philadelphia with a 3-2 lead.
And they are just one game away from glory. Folks, you are looking at the children of destiny. And just when things look bleak, the captain returns to save his team.
Jerry Buss is this incredibly charismatic figure, but a very American figure. He's kind of like a P.T. Barnum, who's sort of like, he was bootstraps guy. He, I think, is the good version of it, but there's a connection between him and like a Trump-like figure, because there's this sort of like, I can make it up as I go along, and it's sort of a con quality to it. He's the version that we as Americans look at as being like what's beautiful about America, I think. But there's a reason why that's an attractive thing in American culture, that sort of like figure who can just sort of, rules be damned, I'll figure it out. And Buss is, I think, the kind of version of that we've lost. And it felt like there was something beautiful about that we could really lean in on.
Claire, let's talk turkey. What turns you on? What gets your blood pumping? Because me, I don't even get out of bed unless I have a hard-on about something. So what excites you?
All right.
What is it going to take for you to turn the forum itself into an attraction?
Money. Advertising, marketing, refurbishments, all of those are expensive.
How much?
Would help if I had access to a budget.
You have access to me. I'm the budget. Now be creative. No idea is too big. We are building Shangri-La.
And they gave us complete sort of freedom to just, the thing that, Adam got involved. It was his production company, but he kind of got involved once the script was written and really just fell in love with it and was like, I want to direct it.
There's also a pretty significant responsibility with that story because so many of these people are still around.
Well, it's like religion. I think it is a secular religion, and people are that passionate about it, and that irrational about it, actually. And very much like religion, there are beliefs, but a lot of them are not necessary, that people take for fact. One thing we dealt with in the show that was really interesting, obviously, yeah, you're telling a story about people that are still alive, and you're not doing it in the way that traditionally gets done, which is either it's a crime thing, in which case no one cares if it's, what's accurate, or it's enough past that people are gone, or it's a movie. And when it's a movie, it ends. There's something different about a continuing story that deals with people who are still alive apart from The Crown, I don't think it's really happened. And that resulted in, a few of the people, which was inevitably, complaining about, I don't like the way I've been portrayed. The irony of that is the people who complained, both admitted they never watched it. And I know for a fact that, from a lot of people who were there, and a lot of people we did portray, that said, yeah, that's you got it. And we did a tremendous amount of research and stand behind what we did. Now, obviously, there's compression of time here and there and the kind of normal thing you do. But the big things that became controversial, those were, for the most part, based on people's own memoirs. For me, ultimately, I don't think the point of telling any story is to tell facts about what happened. I think the point is to tell a story and use it as a lens on something. You have a fealty to being accurate, as you do if you're making a movie about World War II or 9/11 or anything important. This is just basketball, so it's important, but not like that. And but in every story, we make choices, and if we're doing the dramatic version of it, by the way, documentaries make choices too. And so there's a responsibility, but there's also there's a responsibility to why you're telling the story and what you're trying to say. And you have to have your own kind of barometer, and then you're just going to go with it.
So how do you make something that's so big be digestible, essentially, right?
I happen to be a big Lakers fan, but I was adamant about it, and it was a thing that Jim and I talked about initially, was we can't be making this show for fans. It's also for fans, but if that's all we're doing, then who cares? I'm not a fan of the Mafia, for example, and I love The Sopranos, and I'm not a fan of meth at all, but I love Breaking Bad. But the thing I love in those shows, and all the shows I love, is that they don't try to spoon feed the specificity of that world to the audience. They dive into the specificity of that world and they portray it authentically, and through that specificity they find things that connect with us as human beings, because we all have our own specific environments, and we can watch Mad Men, for instance, and see some stuff about the advertising world, and that's quite interesting to us, and you can smell the difference between bullshit and what feels authentic. To me, that's what TV has to offer more than film even, because it gives you an opportunity to just live in these worlds. And my favorite thing about it is when it can really just sort of it transports you in that way.
You've been watching a conversation with Max Borenstein on On Story. On Story is part of a growing number of programs in Austin Film Festival's On Story project that also includes the On Story radio program, podcast, book series, and the On Story archive, accessible through the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University. To find out more about On Story and Austin Film Festival, visit onstory.tv or austinfilmfestival.com.